Reed, and I am the Oregon Policy Director for the Center for Biological Diversity.
Thank you.
I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest and have been in Oregon now for, coming up on 10 years. Is that possible?
Wow.
In the conservation community for most of that time. That was about when I moved to Oregon. It was with the intention of making a career transition to conservation.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to jump to a different question just because you mentioned that. So you mentioned making this transition into the conservation field. And I know from like past conversations with you that entering this field can be a bit of a challenge. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more on that experience and what you learned from it.
Yeah, when I was in my mid-20s, I went to law school, and my intending going to law school was, well, I wanted to be Erin Brockovich. That was what I thought, right? I was really excited about the way that law could be used in the environmental movement. And so I went to law school between 2005 and 2009, and I graduated smack in the middle of the huge housing crisis, this recession. Our dean actually wrote a letter to all of the students saying, sorry, we've never seen this. So, during my time in law school, I'd been doing a lot of conservation internships and really thinking I was setting myself up. And then I graduated and there were just no opportunities. It was really scary. So I ended up taking a job up in Seattle that was law adjacent, doing intellectual property work at the University of Washington. And it was interesting. It was comfortable and not at all what I wanted to be doing. So when I had the opportunity to move to Portland, I thought, it's now or never, right? If I'm going to get too comfortable working in this job. So if I want to make a transition, this is the time. And so I did. I came to Portland. I didn't have a job. I didn't have any kind of network in the conservation community here. And it was so difficult. I'm naturally very introverted. So getting out, putting myself out there feels very uncomfortable. And I applied for so many jobs. I have this absolutely bonkers spreadsheet of all the jobs I applied for every day. It was so demoralizing. And when I started getting job interviews, what I ran into was a couple of things. I was simultaneously being overqualified and underqualified, right? So I was applying for jobs, at entry level because I'd not worked in conservation before, but I think hiring managers would look at my law degree and say, oh, and the previous work experience and say, oh, this person is not entry level. But when I applied for jobs that were higher level, they would say, well, this person has interesting work experience, but nothing directly in conservation. So I kept running into that gap in my experience. And, I made it to the top 2 or 3 in several interviews without getting a job. And, I think it was close to 6 months being unemployed, which was painful. I did contract work on the side to pay my bills. And what I realized was that I had to really do a good job of connecting the dots for hiring managers about how my work experience translated to these roles in conservation and why I wanted to do work in the conservation field to really bring home. I do want to work in an entry level role to get my foot in the door. But I had to kind of do this storytelling for hiring managers because I felt like otherwise, they weren't going to connect the dots for me. So, I got my first job at Oregon Wild working part-time and had to maintain 2 jobs for the first 2 years of my experience in the conservation world. Being able to let go of that second job felt incredibly liberating.
I bet.
It took a lot of work just to get my foot in the door.
Yeah. I'm hoping that when other people hear your story, they'll, I don't know, because I feel like there are a lot of other people in your similar position. So hopefully they'll get some inspiration from that.
Yeah. And I'll say too, my work experience also includes, I worked at the FBI. After that, I worked as a a server in a restaurant. After that, I worked at a caramel corn stand. Then I worked at a law firm as a receptionist. And then I worked at a PR firm briefly. And then in law school, I worked at the law school library. And then I started my own dog walking company. And then I worked at an IP. You know, I think I started to get really self-conscious that that work experience was flighty, you know, and what I realized is that it's all additive. You know, every experience that I had gave me really valuable experience that has translated to the next experience. So yeah, it was not a straight path for sure.
Yeah, I feel like the transferable skills are definitely very important.
Absolutely. And I would love to see hiring managers get more creative and open-minded at seeing how skills in other fields apply here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So my next question is, as a person of color, how have you navigated the predominantly white spaces that are in the conservation field? And then if you could speak a bit on what you learned throughout this process.
Oh yeah, that's a big question. I've been thinking about it a lot. You know, my sister and I have actually been having a lot of conversations about what it means to be mixed race. You know, we are Vietnamese and white. Particularly, you know, these conversations have become more, I think, intense over the last few months with this wave of anti-AAPI violence. And so both of us, I think, have been in this zone of what does our identity mean now and how has it shifted over time? I think being mixed comes with this, it's the privilege and also this burden of being able to shift between worlds. You know, on one hand, we can adapt fairly easily to white culture and in some ways make ourselves almost invisible there. And really that's the burden of it, right? That's the cost of adapting is almost erasing that part of your identity. And then in other venues, it's almost wrestling with that the white part of my identity and trying to assert, you know, this part of my culture that maybe I don't have as much confidence in. So it's this a lot of push-pull, and that's just been true, I think, throughout my life. But one of the patterns that I noticed for myself was, and I think this is relevant to the, you know, assimilating into predominantly white spaces, is you just figure out how to be unassailably competent. So in school, that means here's what I need to do to get the A. And I'm going to do that. Here's what I need to do to get into a good college. Here's what I need to do to be, you know, to excel in this space. And you like figure it out. And then you do that. And I was very successful taking that approach. But I would not say that that approach was conducive to developing my own voice, to really being an analytical thinker, to challenging the status quo. So when I first started in the conservation field, it was absolutely that. It was like, what do I need to do to succeed in this field? And here's the path, right? Here are the things I can produce. Here are the things that I can do. Here are the tools, the channels, all of these things are established. So I just figured out, okay, this is what I need to do to be seen as competent in this field. And I didn't question things very often. You know, it was about what can I do to be accepted, to be valued. And, you know, I think it's only really been in the last couple of years that I've realized how much I've stifled my own voice, how little I questioned the way that we do things in this field because I was scared, right? You know, when your acceptance in a community feels tenuous, right? When you can't take it for granted, it's really threatening to think about challenging, you know, the people or the positions of power. So I think it's really only been the last couple of years that that's been more what I've been wrestling with that in myself and trying to push myself out of that comfort zone. But it's certainly true in conservation spaces where the people who have been in positions of power, who have influence, are predominantly white, and kind of adapt to that way of doing things. And I think once you start butting up against, wait a minute, does this make sense? Wait a minute, does this feel right? It's like I almost have to fight against this lifetime of ingrained habit to accommodate, assimilate, to be nice, to kind of be quiet, at the risk of being, I think the fear there is being rejected, right? Of being then excluded.
Wow, that was really inspiring for me to hear. I feel like I related to you on so many points you made. Yeah, it's very comforting to know that I'm not alone and other people, other like BIPOC people trying to get into the conservation field are not alone in this struggle. You mentioned like the kind of push pull of being biracial or multiracial. Yeah, and at least for me, I feel like there are times where I feel like I don't fit in with like my white side or my Asian side. And that's definitely something that's been a struggle to navigate. But maybe could you speak a little bit on that if you've experienced that and how you've kind of navigated those situations and gained confidence?
Yeah. Well, I just, one thing that I actually realized in the last couple of weeks that's been interesting is my name. My name is Quinn Reed, Quinn, and last name Read. And that was not the name that I was given at birth. My name was Jenny Quincy and Nguyen. And, at a certain point, I started shifting, like my name has adapted over the course of my life with, I think, how I identified in any particular given moment. And there was at some point, I think, where I thought, okay, Quinn Reed, this makes sense to me, right? This is a name that like feels like me. It felt like a name that had sort of, and by the way, I respelled Quinn. It was Quynnh, and now it's Quinn. And in my head, I was like, oh, this is honoring both sides of my culture, right? But really, it was a lot of erasure.
Yeah.
It was, oh, here's a name that is going to be easier to navigate the world with. And I used to almost, I think, be amused when people would read my name and then be surprised when I'd walk in the room. And this happened with job interviews several times where clearly there was this, oh, we need to reorient how we were perceiving this person. And it's really only been in the last year where I've been reintegrating the Vietnamese spelling of my name, because who is that for, right? Who is that really making things easy for? It wasn't for me.
Right.
So even as something as fundamental as my name and how I present that part of my identity has shifted. And just to be able to feel confident enough to be like, this is part of who I am. It feels like some growth. But I think, in terms of this experience, one thing that happened fairly recently that I felt, I'm going to tell the story and it's not going to seem like that big of a deal, but it really got me. And I work in this fantastic coalition of wildlife conservation professionals. And one of the things we've been really working on is trying to increase representation on Oregon state boards and commissions, which are to date still predominantly white spaces and are very influential and important in making policy. And we were interviewing a woman who was interested in serving on the commission. And in this coalition, there are two Asian women, myself and one other. And as we were preparing to talk with this woman who was a potential candidate, someone else in the coalition said, oh, but I'm really uncomfortable with a bunch of white people, coming at this woman and saying like, we want more diversity on the commission. And I remember thinking, hold on, there's two people here who are not white and we just got lumped in. And I realized, oh, okay, this is where we start bumping up against this almost like self-erasure, right? Having worked so hard to fit in that people no longer see us that way. And then there's also that, again, to speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, excuse me, but that's not my identity or not my primary identity, also feels sort of intimidating.
Mm,
Because now you're otherizing yourself in a way.
right.
So yeah, that was really, I feel that was really eye-opening for me, is to realize, oh, okay, this is not just about how I see myself, this is also how other people see me in the community, and um, also how I've presented my own identity and maybe suppressed parts of my identity. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like that's very eye-opening because I don't know, I feel like a lot of people of color go through life and suppress parts of themselves to fit in,
Mhm.
and to assimilate.
Yeah.
So yeah, that I feel like that's gonna start some self-reflection on my end as well.
I feel like it's an ongoing, lifelong process. It's constantly getting challenged.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other example I would just wanted to mention, and it's because, we're in the thick of the legislative session, but the governor assembled this racial justice council late last year. And as part of that, there's this environmental equity committee.
Mm.
And so it's a group of predominantly people of color. It was a very exciting, group of folks to have together, with the idea that, we would talk about policy priorities to advance environmental equity in Oregon. As we got closer to the legislative session, we had this package of policy proposals. And then there was this moment of, okay, so now it's time to go out and promote these things. And we had some very uncomfortable conversations about, okay, well, who wants to put their name on this? Because you write an op-ed about this, you're going to be subjected to a ton of abuse, which in fact it has played out. If you talk too explicitly about race, you're going to turn off. Well, you're going to turn off the racist, is what you're going to turn off.
Yeah.
You're going to turn off potential supporters. So there was this really uncomfortable, first, it felt like we had this safe space where we could really talk about some of the issues and really think about solutions, but then to translate that into a space where decision makers could act on it meant then completely reconfiguring back to this like white culture, right? And especially in Oregon, where talking too explicitly about these things can be, again, can backfire. And I'm rolling my eyes even saying that because it's so icky.
Yeah.
But I've seen that play out. And, as we advocate for things, we have to be so gentle and nice. And we have to use this coded language. And I've had to sit through hearings where elected officials used really ugly, also only semi-coded language to express racist views. And again, as a person of color, and looking at the power structures, you're in this position of, how do I navigate this? Do you play within this system, make people comfortable, so that you can hopefully get a bill passed, right? Or do you say what's up and challenge people more directly? And I don't think there's an easy answer there, but I see people, myself included, really struggling with that dynamic.
Yeah.
And then also, frankly, looking for, the white allies. Like, okay, well, you assembled to this group and said, come up with these solutions. So where are you now?
Right.
And it's, why is it up to us now to make people comfortable and to, ease the way for these much needed policies? So,
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's definitely something that I have struggled with as well. Yeah.
yeah.
And then I also wanted to ask about kind of your career path, because you are in a pretty unique position of having worked for 3 different environmental organizations. So, Oregon Wild Defenders of Wildlife, and now the Center for Biological Diversity. So,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how have conversations about EDI changed across time, and those organizations? do you feel that the conversation is moving forward, or do you feel like you need to start over each time?
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I have a lot of love and respect for all of these organizations and the people that I have worked with there. Um, and it's been interesting, to see the trajectory of how these organizations are approaching diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice issues, both while I've been in it and then after I leave. Um, I guess what I would say, or one of the patterns I've noticed, is that it really matters who is in leadership positions.
Mm.
And whether or not the perception is diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice are important and fundamental to this group's mission, or whether it is something that we have to pay attention to and we have to check this box. And I think that, all of these groups have been somewhere on that spectrum, or have moved somewhere on that spectrum over time. I think it's really exciting when you see, better representation on organizational boards, the folks that are really calling the shots. I still feel like in all these organizations, one of the places I kind of get frustrated is at the hiring stage.
Mm.
Because there's this gap too, right? It's, if your organization looks one way and you're someone who's applying for a job and you see faces that look nothing like you, that's not going to feel very welcoming. And I've certainly experienced that. But then it takes a big cultural shift internally for an organization to change their hiring practices to reach new audiences. Otherwise, it's just kind of more of the same. So I feel like I've seen, that's the part where I feel like there's still, in my experience, like a lot of work to be done. But I've also feel like I've seen a lot of growth. I feel like I've seen a lot of people who have really embraced this as a fundamental part of their job, as a fundamental part of their organizational mission. And that feels really exciting. Of course, all of this stuff happens in fits and starts, but I do feel like there's growth. But I feel like it will feel more real when there's, more people of color in management positions, more people who are actually helping to establish those policies, just more people being hired at every level. So yeah, and I will say every time I am at an organization, whether I'm starting from scratch, each organization is so different, but gosh, I'm trying to think of how best to answer that question. I've been in organizations where there's been an element of tokenization, where, a picture of me and my son at a rally got posted without my permission, where there's a disconnect between, we're going to celebrate this work, that we see our staff members who are people of color, out there doing in the field, but we're not going to invest in it, right? So, it's kind of, I think all these organizations can look at, what are we putting out there? What are we celebrating? And then what are we truly making long-term investments in? And trying where possible to close that gap.
Yeah, thank you. What advice would you give to a young person of color seeking to enter the conservation field? You mentioned a bit about the hiring process and how intimidating it can be to enter a predominantly white field. But if there's anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think really owning the things. Yeah, I think if I was talking to someone who's trying to, get their foot in the door here in this field, I would say to really think deeply about what motivates you. Like, what is it that gets you up in the morning? Where do you want to make your mark in this field, and to stay really, really true to that. And to really own your own motivation for doing it, right? Because I think that I downplayed why I do what I do, because there's a certain profile for conservation, right? You know, you're this rugged backpacker who's experienced the wilderness and therefore are inspired to save it. Well, people come to this movement for a lot of different reasons, and I think honoring that for yourself and really, I think, conveying that to hiring managers, because I think that's how you bring that kind of authentic self that gets people really excited. Like, this person brings energy. The other thing too, and I know this is easier said than done, and I struggle with it and suspect I'll struggle with it through my entire life, is constantly asking yourself, like, do I believe in this? Do I think this is right? Or have I been conditioned to believe in this and think this is right? And to challenge it. And to recognize too, of course, that like, there are frankly things that we have to do just to survive, right? And as professionals, and that's real. And I think it would be kind of flip to say, just don't do that.
Yeah.
Just challenge things, challenge the status quo. It's not that easy. But I think to like check in with yourself repeatedly about how things feel, because I think something this movement needs is energy and creativity and new perspectives. People who will say, well, okay, well, that's the way you've been doing it for 30 years, but some new approaches here we could be trying. And to understand how valuable that is, and that, you know, that's something that these organizations need. So I think checking in with yourself constantly to make sure that like you're being authentic to yourself, and building a community of people where it's safe to express those things. And I think building power that way. And that may mean, you know, community of people within organizations, or communities of people like environmental professionals of color, you know, which are folks throughout the conservation community, just to help you. But I think it's just to remember too, that your views, your experiences, your perspectives are valuable and needed.
Right. Wow. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like this has been a great community building experience for me too. Just this interview series, I'm like, it's really helping me, and I hope it'll help the same way.
Absolutely. It's a super cool community.
Yeah.
It's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering, like, speaking of young people, I'm wondering if becoming a parent has changed your perspective at all on anything related to the environmental movement.
Oh man, on so many levels. I will share this story, and it's kind of personal. It's far enough in the rearview mirror at this point where I feel like this isn't as weird to share. But I remember being at this big, it's like the big environmental law conference in Oregon. You'll hear it referred to as PILC or as ELAW, and it's down at University of Oregon in Eugene. And I was there one year, and there was a organization there that had a table, and they were giving out stickers that said like, thanks for not breeding. And yeah, it was like a, you know, zero population kind of group. Yeah. And I was chatting with some colleagues, both former and current colleagues, who were expressing this anti-breeder sentiment. And I was sitting there thinking, oh boy, okay, this is awkward, because right after that conversation, I had to go back to my hotel and inject my stomach with hormones because I was doing IVF at the time. Here I was surrounded by people who were doing this work. You know, on one hand, you know, working for organizations whose mission statements are about future generations, and yet expressing this pretty strong anti having children viewpoint, while I'm trying desperately to have a child. Right. And again, another time where I was just like, okay, I'm just going to silence myself. Right? I mean, that could have been an opportunity where I spoke up, and now, you know, regret that I didn't. But I did. I felt really self-conscious in that moment. And, you know, went on to, adopt my son. And I think that that's impacted the way that I look at my work in a number of ways. One is that he too is biracial. His biological father is Black and his biological mother is white. And I've had to ask myself this question several times of, how is my work or my advocacy improving or impacting the way he's going to move through the world or the way he's going to experience the world? And to the extent that it doesn't, it's really left me questioning things. And I think that's another part of, kind of tying back to the advice. It's like checking in constantly of, wait a minute, does this feel like the highest and best use of, my short time here on earth and my time on a day-to-day basis? But, again, my work is in wildlife conservation. So I think another level in which having a child has impacted things is, when I see him get really friggin' excited about seeing a squirrel or a crow or a duck at the park, or when we go to the zoo, right? And he loses his mind over the seals or the elephants. It's this, there is something about, seeing the world through those fresh eyes that remind you that, love of the natural world is so inherent to all of us. So I think, on multiple levels, having a child has made me check in with myself about what I'm doing with my work and wanting it to be as impactful as possible and wanting it to be something that does improve the way that my son's going to experience the world. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I'm also wondering how your law degree and experience in that field shapes and influences the perspectives that you bring to the conservation field.
Yeah. When I was in law school, I think I realized pretty early on that I didn't want to do the Erin Brockovich path. Litigation was not for me. I have, a lot of friends for whom that is the path, and it's really, really interesting, but I just knew that wasn't right for me. And so I think I struggled initially to figure out what it looked like. And I certainly worried at times, oh my gosh, did I even need to get a law degree? Why did I do that? But to everything being additive to every experience, translating and I think informing, where you're at now. I think it was really important. One of the ways that I use it directly has been in writing legislation. I didn't think about that. I never took a how to write a bill class in law school. I don't even think that was offered. And yet having that perspective to be able to look at statutory language and say, here's what needs to change, but also here's how it's going to impact this over here and this over here. And I think has been really invaluable. And I think I took it for granted. But, I've talked to some, non-lawyer friends who, maybe that feels more intimidating. So I think that's a place where it's been really useful. The other, this is more superficial, right? But it's credibility. And that I don't really like that because, as I alluded to earlier, there was that being over and underqualified thing at the same time. But there is some credibility that you have when you can say that you have this credential. When you're in a space, whether you're working on legislation or some other kind of policy, I don't know. I feel like it can open doors, but really I do think it's that, the analytical tools that you derive from being in law school that are so helpful and apply in so many places. That and writing, the type of writing that you learn to do in law school has come in handy so many times. A lot of what I do, you comment on various proposals at, the state, regional, federal level, and it almost becomes second nature after law school. So I think it's been really useful. Is it necessary? maybe not maybe, depend on based on the path I took. I'm not sure, but it has also been very useful.
Right. Yeah. I guess just going back to those transferable skills.
Exactly. And I did, actually took on my first little bit of litigating in the conservation field last year. And it was so intimidating to be brand new at something again, and also exciting. So again, you've got that in your toolbox whenever you need it. So
right.
it gives you some increased options.
Okay. I just have a few more questions because I want to be respectful of your time. But I'm wondering, because climate change is obviously very complex and intersectional. It's not only an environmental issue, but also an equity issue as well. So how do you blend all of these factors into the work that you do?
I'm going to be honest with you, it's sometimes really hard not to be completely siloed, even within my own work. Oh, here now I'm doing wildlife conservation. Oh, here now I'm doing climate work. Oh, here now I'm doing environmental equity work. So I struggle sometimes to bridge that gap. And some of that is the nature of the work that I do. For me, environmental justice is something that I wanted to be focused on. I wanted it to be a fundamental part of my work. So, for example, I'm on the governor's environmental justice task force here in Oregon, sort of on the environmental equity committee. So I'm always looking for those opportunities, which are not inherent in the wildlife conservation field. So some of my hope and my reasoning for that is, how can I find ways to weave in issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice into this field that has kind of, I don't want to say been resistant to it, because that's not quite right. But trying to find more of those connections and trying to make them more inherent or obvious to people. I think the connection is somewhat easier when you're talking about, if your position is you're a climate justice organizer, right? Those links are built in.
Right.
When you're doing endangered species conservation work, it's a little bit different. And in fact, I've heard, this refrain from people of, oh, well, that's not as relevant to my work. Almost this idea that if you're in the space, environmental equity is extracurricular. Like, oh, that's something extra. And I have felt that,
Yeah.
So I think it's really trying to find those connections. So one example would be, we work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife here in Oregon. And one of the things we get criticized for is the so-called single species management. This idea, well, we don't want to do all this stuff just for this one critter, right? Because it has all these impacts, and it's really about habitat. But if we start talking about habitat, they'll say, well, you don't really care about this critter. All you care about is habitat. Well, yes, and these things are not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And then at the same time, the Department of Fish and Wildlife just adopted this climate and ocean change policy, but it's separate. So I think it's looking for these ways to integrate all of these pieces. So maybe it's, pushing them harder to look at endangered species through the lens of climate change. It's, making sure that the Fish and Wildlife Commission actually looks like what the rest of Oregon looks like, and represents more than just the views of a handful of special interests.
Right.
So I think there's lots of ways to integrate it. But I think a lot of it is just, if it's integrated in yourself, you can find ways to make those connections.
Right.
I'm also really lucky to work at an organization that gives, folks a lot of flexibility to explore their interests, and to, I think, sort of have their job descriptions evolve in accordance with their interests. So I think that's, something that I've been lucky to find. But it's a lot of times it's, do you as a person look for those connections if you're not in a field where those connections are inherent.